Okay, I think we can start and people will can still start to trickle in while I say my introduction. So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nikki Yakovella, and I'm the director of the Outsider Art Fair, and I'm really excited to welcome you to the talk, which focuses on grassroots art in Vermont, beautiful part of the world, and specifically how the Bennington Museum came to collect outsider art, and we're going to talk about some of the works in their collection. But before I hand over to our moderator, I'm just okay, so before I hand over to everyone, I just want to talk a little bit about the Outsider Art Fair. So the Outsider Art Fair is currently it's on till February 7, which is Sunday. The fair looks a little different this year. It's a hybrid model. So we have online 45 incredibly strong online viewing rooms, which are up for you all to view until February 7. And they consist of galleries from all around the world, including one big town gallery from Vermont, a local one. So I really highly recommend you take the time, especially on a snowy day like today where I am in New York. I can't think of anything better to do than listen to a talk and then go peruse some rooms online. We also have an in-person component, and that's 7 exhibitions across 5 locations. And if you're currently in Manhattan, that too is up until February 7, and those galleries will reopen on Wednesday. So you've got from Wednesday to Sunday to go and see those. All the information is online, outsiderartfair.com/New York. You can purchase a pass, schedule an appointment to go see the galleries, and of course, go and view our online viewing rooms, which I highly recommend you do. Just quickly, some housekeeping. At the bottom here, you'll see a little Q&A icon. We'll take some questions, most likely at the end of the talk. So if you have any questions, you can just type them in the Q&A section. Also in the chat section, we'll put some informative links throughout the talk as well. So keep an eye out on that. So yes, this is a panel discussion, and it will explore the development of a collection of works by self-taught artists working beyond the mainstream art world, at least initially, at a medium-sized regionally focused museum in rural southwestern Vermont. That is the Bennington Museum. So I'm going to hand over to Jamie Franklin. He is the Director of Collections and Exhibitions at the Bennington Museum, and he will introduce the rest of the panelists and take it from here. Thanks, Jamie. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Nikki. And just before we continue forward, I know we had a conversation. We weren't going to have the panelists mute themselves, but I think I'm hearing that there's a bit of an echo. So if Kathy, Gregg, it looks like Ray is already muted. If you could just mute yourselves while we're not talking, because it's going to be a back and forth, and then we'll be chatting, kind of having one-on-one conversations, and then hopefully have some discussion as a group at the end. But before we dive into those discussions, I wanted to provide a little bit of background for folks who aren't familiar with the Bennington Museum, kind of where we're coming from. And this talk is really why we made the choice to collect the work of artists working outside of the mainstream art world, and kind of how they fit into the larger mission of the Bennington Museum. So as Nikki said, we're situated here in the southwest corner of Vermont, about an hour east of Albany, New York, the capital, and just a half an hour north of Williamstown and North Adams, Massachusetts, in the northwest corner of Massachusetts. And so we're a regionally focused museum that looks at the history, art, and culture of our region. And so we date the museum back to the mid-19th century. We opened to the public here with a permanent collection in 1928. And we've been showing the work of artists from our region really since that beginning in the early 20th century, almost 100 years ago now. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now so we can see the images that I have in the PowerPoint. Let me just find my PowerPoint. Here we go. Excuse me. Okay, share that. And here we go. There we go. Um, so um, those of you who are familiar with the museum probably know that we have the largest public collection of the work of Grandma Moses, Anna Mary Robertson Moses. She lived and worked not far from Bennington, just over on the New York state of the line, about a 15-minute drive, 10 miles from Bennington. And we have the world's largest public collection. And so when I came to the museum back in 2005, I always felt we have a gallery devoted to her work, always on view, between 20 and 30 paintings. And she is well known in the general public, but she's kind of put on a pedestal in a way, like there was no context. And so a lot of the exhibitions that I've curated here at the museum have sought to kind of put Grandma Moses in a larger context. And so we also have a kind of great collection of traditional historical folk art from the 19th century. We have a great cooler on the left by the Nortons, who were here in Bennington making pottery throughout the 19th century, and a portrait by an unknown itinerant artist on the right. These are the sorts of things that the museum was collecting and known for throughout the 20th century. But in 2013, we started to think about how we could kind of connect our collections with a 21st century audience. We had a new director, Robert Wolterstorff, arrive in 2012, and we started thinking strategically about exhibitions, programming, and collections. And so the slide that we're looking at is a portrait on the left of Luman Preston Norton, actually one of the members of the Norton family who made this jar on the left, or cooler on the left. And on the right is a painting by Alice Neal, Isabetta, from 1934. We paired their work in an exhibition in 2014 called Alice Neal, Erastus Salisbury Field Painting the People. And it was a way to shine like a new light on both of their work. So get people to think about it a little bit differently, which gives you a sense of kind of my curatorial strategy and practice. We've also been actively collecting historical folk art as well, but today's talk, of course, is about the work of modern and contemporary self-taught artists. And the image that we have on the screen is a painting by Jessica Park called Presto Quartz Heater. It was painted in 1986. It's an acrylic on paper, measures 12 by 18 inches. And Jessica Park is an artist who lives and works down in Williamstown, Massachusetts. I was familiar with her work. I went to grad school down in Williamstown at Williams College. And Tony Jangarelli, who is a professor at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts, he's now retired, but continues to work and teach courses there, started in 2004 what's known as the Jessica Park Project. And this was an initiative to work with Jessica, her family, as well as his students to create exhibitions and books about Jessica's work to share it with a wider audience. And so in 2013, I reached out to Tony as we started to think about collecting this work, and he helped connect me with Jessie and her family. And this is the first work that I acquired directly from Jessica for the museum's collection after we started this initiative. She's known for these sort of kind of visionary images of everyday objects such as this. This is a electric heater with that kind of vibrating light of coils there at the bottom center. And then in 2018, I curated a solo exhibition of her work called Enthusiasms, the personal paintings of Jessica Park. She came to public renown starting in the mid-1980s. Her mother, Clara Park, published a rather famous book in 1968, I believe, called The Siege, which documented her experiences raising Jessica, who has autism. And autism was fairly little known back then. And The Siege documents Clara and her family's experiences raising a young girl with autism. And by the 1980s, Jessica would accompany Clara when she went to talk to audiences about autism. And somebody kind of jumped up in the audience and said, is her artwork available? Because artwork was one of the ways in which Jessie was able to connect with the world. It allowed her to kind of develop her communication skills and kind of social skills. And so her work began to get renowned in the mid 80s, into the 90s. She started doing commissions for people. But the show that I curated in 2018 focused on the first decade of her work, like this painting from 1986. And this work from 1991, which was a gift from the family after the exhibition, called Courier House and Lamp. And this work, which was from the last decade of her production, between 2008 and 2018, when the exhibition was, really focusing on works that she was creating either for herself. In 2008, she started making paintings that she held on to rather than for commission. And so, just exploring her work. But, starting in 2013, I started researching who are other artists living and working in the larger Vermont area, and started reaching out to scholars, curators, the artists directly. And one of the first ones, I came across the work of Paul Humphrey, whose work we'll look at shortly. But it was through an exhibition at the American Folk Art Museum in 2013 called Women's Studies, which showed Humphrey's work alongside of Eugene von Breunchenhain. I'm forgetting the other artists, but it looked at portraits of women by self-taught artists. And that was how I became aware of Gregg Blasdel, who lives and works in Northern Vermont. And he has a long history of working with self-taught artists. He's an artist himself. And he published an article in Arts in America in 1968 called The Grassroots Artist. So Gregg, if you can unmute yourself. We're looking at an image of Clarence Schmidt's House of Mirrors right now, which is one of the artists that you documented and published and curated exhibitions on in the late 60s and early 70s. Can you just give us a little bit of background on how you came to working with self-taught artists and kind of documenting and sharing their work with the larger world?
Sure. My first experience actually was a young boy in the town I grew up in, Kansas, and a block away from my house, there was a man named David Rousseau, and he had built a little futuristic concrete garden in his front yard with colored concrete. There were blues and reds and yellows, and it had a fish pond below it. And I probably walked by it 100 times. I took it for granted that it was always going to be there. And of course, years later, when I went to the university, I ran into a fellow art student, Ray Wilbur, and his brother had told him about a crazy environment in Western Kansas, the Garden of Eden. And in the spring of that year, we went out to see it. And in a radius of 20 miles, I think we located 3 to 5 different people working independently, creatively, most of them in concrete. And that really started my quest for researching. And soon others were added in the state. And as we showed slides, as I showed slides, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, about a little prelude to Clarence Schmidt, actually. When I enrolled in the MFA graduate program at Cornell University in 1966, and 2 years prior to that, 1964, in a magazine, the Saturday Evening Post, they had published an article on Clarence Schmidt. I had a brother living in Boston, and he was coming back to Ithaca, traveling over to Ithaca. I said, well, stop up and see Clarence. And he did, and came down to see me. And I went over the following, I think it was in 66 when I first met Clarence. And I visited him for probably every 2 weeks for the next, I don't know how many years. That photograph that you see that's up on the placard that was a photograph my brother took of him that day. And it was the first self-image that Schmidt put up into his environment. But when I was at Cornell in my graduate seminar, I was showing the slides, and Jim Dine was the visiting artist at the time, and also a visiting writer at the university was B.H. Friedman. B.H. Friedman knew Alfonso Osorio, and he invited Osorio up to Cornell to look at my work, look at my slides. And he was so excited about it that he sent images to Jean Dubuffet. Dubuffet wrote back and said, wanted me to share images of all of the sites that I was visiting in the States, which I did. I started sending him photographs. And Osorio, as kind of a reimbursement, every now and then would send me a small check. And on one of the memos of the check that he sent me once, he had written for Grassroots Art. And at the time, this just happened to line up and coincide with the Art in America article. I was just starting to work on it, and I was struggling to come up with a title or identify the artist in some ways being unique that I was talking about. And it occurred to me, Grassroots was perfect. It fit right in. And so the article, Some Grassroots Artists in America, which was consequential, I think, you know, for what's come to pass. Anyway, I'm going to talk about Schmidt just a little bit more. This is a great example of something I want to mention. Everything was coated in tar, and all kinds of concoctions he could add to that tar or asphalt, and paint of every sort, enamels, everything was covered. And his idea behind this was that it would preserve it. Of course, it just had the opposite effect. It trapped water, and eventually, years later, you know, dry rot set in on the wood and stuff. But he was unique. He covered 7.5 acres of land with these shrines and stackings and so forth. It was all dry key stone construction with the shrine set up on top of everything. And he did not go back and repair things. He kept moving forward. In fact, it was hard to keep up with his work. So prolific. He told me at one time, he said, I get up at 4 a.m. in the morning and start wrapping tree branches with aluminum foil, so I'll have enough material to work with throughout the day. And the foil became a real element in his work in many ways. He must have had a terrible, he had a lot of Sara Lee cakes that came wrapped in foil packages, shrimp cocktails for the little glasses he used all over the place. But foil, he would get huge industrial rolls. I didn't know where it was coming from. And everything, usually once it was coated with the tar and paint, he would tear the foil into small pieces and apply it like you might apply gold leaf or silver leaf. He would face a piece, and it was fairly durable.
You know, Gregg, it wasn't until I had seen your photographs. You know, a lot of people have seen photographs like this, and just to be clear, these are Gregg's photos documenting Schmidt's environment. It wasn't until I saw a lot of your photos close up that I realized kind of how much of a sculptural artist, you know, in the kind of contained sense of sculpture that we know. And I really loved your documentation of Schmidt's work. Of course, you went on to curate an exhibition of his work when you moved to UVM in the early 70s. And I think also the photo panels of some of your work traveled in the exhibition Naives and Visionaries, which was organized by the Walker Art Center in 1974. Right, yes. This is just another image that you took of Jesse Outlaw Howard, as well as a work from your personal collection of Howard's work that we included in our 2015 exhibition here at the Bennington Museum, that combined selections from you and your partner, Jennifer Koch's collection with things from our collection. Can you just tell us a little bit about Howard? He's one of my favorite of the artists that you documented.
I first heard of Jesse Outlaw Howard from an article in the Kansas City Star. And I was at the University of Kansas at the time. And I decided to visit and went to Fulton, Missouri, where he was. I think it was in the early 60s. And I can't tell you exactly where, but I had heard someplace that he was kind of cranky, to be careful and so forth. And as I usually would do when I go into a small town or a small area looking for an artist, I usually go to the police station and ask, because they know where everybody lives. In this case, and I don't know why I stopped at the Dodge dealership. I think it was all the flags and balloons or something. They were having a sale. And I asked one of the Dodge boys about Jesse, and he said, "Oh yes, be careful. He might take a shot at you up there," you know, and told us these kind of awful stories. We drove up. He lived a little ways outside of town, and he came out of the house, and it turned out he was a really sweet, gentle man. And I visited him many times over the years, and always had he was always welcoming, always eager to show all of his work. He had 10 studios, sheds around his property filled with signs, and he literally painted on everything. The door to a dryer, rubber tires, saw blades, anything that he could acquire, lay claim to around the farm. And he would paint on it and very cleverly design his lettering around the shape of the piece. Even one of my favorite things he had was the roll-up blinds, up and down blinds, that when you put it up, you could roll it down, read the sign, then roll it back up again.
And you know, you see, obviously he had lots of signs, and he kind of plastered them on his fence. You know, I understand the story was that he had some, you know, political and religious views that he wanted to share, and then people started stealing his signs. So
yes,
it was basically, his installation was an attempt to basically say, you can't keep up with my production rate, basically.
There was a small college in the town, and a lot of the students would come out and take the signs at night. And he had a lot of problems, but you're right, he would make a sign about everything. He started, I think his first sign was painted in 1950, and it was erected on the lawn of Fulton, the courthouse lawn, and it was a scolding of the city fathers for something they had done. It wasn't on his property, but he later started this fence. He's up on a ladder. It was quite a large fence, ran down the frontage of his property. And that's where most of the signs were displayed. If you would visit, he would go in and take you through all the studios and bring out signs that were piled every place. There was another story that was interesting about Jesse. He had a dispute with a neighbor, and his way to settle it was he made a devil's walk, or I've heard it called the Devil's Alley before too, where both neighbors agreed that a certain amount of space should be fenced off between their properties, and it was space that nobody would use. And he had just built that before the first time I visited him. He was very proud of the fact that that's the way he was going to settle the dispute. I don't think he used a sign, which he usually would do.
Well, you know, I wanted to kind of give a little bit of background on these artists who are now, you know, very well-known names in the field of outsider art, just to give a sense that you were kind of instrumental in helping to bring this sort of work to the mainstream, and, you know, thinking about how a small regional museum in the 20-teens can start collecting the work of art. It's thanks to you, artists and scholars who have documented this work and brought it to the public collection, public notice. As I mentioned in my intro, this is one of your portraits of Paul Humphrey, whose work I discovered at the American Folk Art Museum. And I reached out to you and contacted you and ended up acquiring a group of 20 of Paul's work for the museum's collection, because he was a lifelong Vermont resident, was born in Pulteney, lived in Brattleboro, and then moved to Burlington, up near where you are now. Can you just give us a little bit of a background on kind of your relationship with Paul and his work, and how you were able to help bring his work to public attention?
Sure. I met Paul in 1990, and Paul always had a manager, or somebody who was kind of looking after him. And in this case, it was my artist named Michael Tyberski. And I didn't know Paul when he was pushing a cart around the streets, collecting cans and bottles. He collected them to buy colored pencils for his work and to make money to buy Xerox, run the Xerox machines. I met Tyberski and met Paul, and Michael and I ended up doing an exhibition of his work at St. Michael's College. I think we had 300 of his Sleeping Beauties up on the wall. The origin of Sleeping Beauty, the way Paul tells it, his daughter, Sandra Sue, was his muse, and he had some time on his hands, as he put it, and he said, I'm going to draw my daughter, and he made several attempts, and it inspired him to keep drawing. And Sandra Sue, as Paul tells the story, worked at the small college in Burlington, and she would give him pictures of the co-eds, and he would take them and work with them. And for years, I didn't know, I knew Paul for approximately 10 years. Before he passed away. I had no idea how he made these pieces. They were clearly Xeroxed and manipulated in some ways. The two images you're looking at now, they're collages that he inadvertently, he was always giving me drawings, and he had inadvertently put a couple of the collages in a box. You can see the way they're pasted together, collaged together, pieced together. And this was the first step in the collage, preliminary drawing. And originally, all of the shading and shadows, he would do it with burnt match ash and cigarette ashes. And he would put it through a screen, a fine screen, and rub it onto the image to create a halftone effect or a shading effect. He stopped smoking at some point and started relying on the Xerox machine. After he would Xerox an image multiple times, it would start to pixelate and break down and give a similar effect of a halftone in some ways. But anyway, this was the first step he would go through. Once he had collaged it, pieced it together, and the collages were sometimes incredibly complex. Then he would take it down, Xerox it. The last step was to color it with colored pencils. Over the years, Paul had created really seamless story about his family, his daughter, Sandra Sue, who we see in the upper left, and his son-in-law, who was a prison guard. Every time there was a new grandchild, he had a photograph up in his studio, and it was seamless. After he died, I wasn't able to go to the memorial service, but Jennifer went to the memorial service. It turned out that it was an entire fabrication. Sandra Sue didn't exist, his family didn't exist. All of the people that he talked about, the only people that existed in his life that I knew of were people such as the dumpster diver and the Duke. And these were all street people that assisted him or helped him in some way. And which I eventually became part of that group in a sense, because when Tyberski died, I kind of became Paul's manager and helped him with whatever problems he was having. At that point, he was in a wheelchair, but he was the hardest working artist in Vermont, I'm convinced. He worked every day. He was diligent, constantly working and calling me up to go get new pencils, this. Sometimes he'd call me 6 or 7 times a day.
No, and you then, helped him get his work out into the world. I know
I did.
In '99, his work was included in a exhibition and catalog in Cologne, Germany. I believe that was through the Zonder collection.
Zanders, yes.
Yep. So he was juxtaposed with the work of Eugene von Breunchenheim, Morton Bartlett, and Henry Darger, who are kind of giants in this field. But this kind of intense psychological, repetitive work, like you say, I mean, he was working every day at these images, and it's really incredibly powerful work. And so thank you for introducing him into the world, and for helping to bring attention to artists like these. And you published an article in Raw Vision magazine on Humphrey's work, and we'll share a link to kind of a snippet of that. But thank you. And I think we're gonna move on to Kathy now. Grassroots Artists was the title of Gregg's article that was published in 1968, but it's also the name of an organization which Kathy Stark has worked at for the last 20 years, which has been another kind of instrumental institution in bringing the work of self-taught artists from Vermont to public attention. And Kathy is a artist in her own right. Kathy, can you tell us a little bit about how GRACE, or Grassroots Art and Creative Effort, came to be, and kind of the philosophy behind it, and how you've worked with artists to help share their work with the world?
Okay, yeah. So 1975, Don Sinceri was an artist in New York, and he moved to Vermont permanently in 1974. And he was working at the St. Johnsbury Convalescent and Rehab Center. And he noticed that the people were doing a lot of kind of drawing at tables. So he started working with them, being with them, basically. And from that, he developed a program in 1975 called GRACE, Grassroots Art and Community Effort. And Don had a very specific philosophy of non-instruction. You're a facilitator. You hang out with people and you chat, and you make a very safe, nurturing environment. So he was doing that. He was bringing art materials to the convalescent center and working with people. He noticed that people had really amazing work. What's on the screen is Larry Bissonette, Robert Gove is on the right, and Sidney Bemis. And these were just pieces created on the spot or by people. They were definitely communicating their visions and their thoughts. So from there, Grace went on to operate in Hardwick as a drop-in kind of a weekly workshop, 2 hours on a Thursday, and people would come. There were contacts with mental health facilities in the area. So people from those facilities came, people from the community, and elders from the community also. And the facilitator, Michael Gray, was a facilitator for a large number of years, and he was a wonderful facilitator. He had a great way of being with people. He was gentle. People were very encouraged to just experiment and make art, and fabulous art was created.
Yep.
Eventually, yeah.
I'm sorry, Kathy. I'm just gonna, mention. So as you said, like all of these artists, were part of GRACE workshops. Larry at top, Larry Bissonette, who's still alive and working, a great artist based out of not outside of Burlington. Sidney Bemis and Robert Gove. these are all three works that were in our 2015 exhibition that I worked with Gregg on. The bottom two works are from Gregg and Jennifer's collection, and the top work was given to the museum by Marcy Hermansader and Jonathan Flackis back in 2015. I'll just say, the artist that's been most strongly associated with Grace over the years is Gayleen Aiken, whose work, one of 5 that Marcy and Jonathan gave to the museum. And actually, Jonathan, I think, found these works through the Bread and Puppet Theater. And as I understand it, Don Sunseri would work with the artist and actually create exhibitions out in the open air, what was known as the Pine Forest, where they would tack works to trees in the forest. And so he acquired these, Jonathan Flackis acquired these in the mid-'80s after Don Sunseri had began working with Gayleen Aiken. And Gayleen was born in Barrie, Vermont, and lived there all of her life and had been making work from a very young age. And so can you tell us just a little bit about Gayleen and your experiences with her? I know you knew her before she passed away in 2005.
Right, I did. We would go to Gayleen's house to get her work. She didn't come to Grace. You couldn't get to her house before noon. She slept late. And the house had paths through it. She had lots of magazines and papers all over the place. She was very, very animated. If you've seen the movie, she was exactly like that. She was very animated. She would like to play music for you. She didn't like you to leave. So you had to sort of say you had to leave. You had to start about an hour before you wanted to leave. We would pick up work from her there. And she called Grace the Gayleen Aiken Museum. She was very, very prolific. She had lots of pictures hanging all over her house, and she had sets of the cardboard cousins. She had 24 fictitious cardboard cousins. She made up, they were the means of her, they were the body of her work, actually, doing things. And it was all around the granite industry, and the cousins all had very distinct personalities. And when you'd go to see her, she'd talk about the cousins. And I think she called Grace her museum. She would come to Grace. We'd pick her up and bring her for her birthday party, and we'd have a birthday party for her. Mm-hmm. She was charming. She was difficult because she had very strong opinions about things. And she would always write on the back of her pictures. In her home, she had lots of paintings that were hanging all over the place. And she'd write on the back little messages, not for sale. She also kept incredible records. She did diaries of everything. If you wrote to her, she had them by the year. So if you wrote to her, she would, in 1970 something, if you wrote to her, you'd be in the 1970 book. She'd write very, very tiny writing, and she'd write what you wrote, and she'd write what she answered. So these books, Grace has all these books, and they're amazing. They're spectacular.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting you say, she never worked directly in Grace workshops. I mentioned, Jessica Park at the beginning. She had a relationship with Pure Vision Arts, which is an organization that shows at the Outsider Art Fair. But Jessica never worked through Pure Vision. But like Gayleen, institutions like Grace and Pure Vision Arts, in addition to helping artists that are working outside of the mainstream actually create work, giving them the space, the time, the materials, and the encouragement, they also, help bring it to a wider audience. And Gayleen's work, she had been creating the Rainbilly Cousins since she was a young girl. The house that you see in this first image, and her father passed away when she was in her teens. And so the Rainbilly Cousins were kind of this imaginary family that she created to kind of, I think in some ways, kind of, give her something to engage with on a daily basis. Like you said, she would take these records. And I know that Louise Ross brought the Rainbilly Cousins to the Outsider Art Fair, I think in 2015 or 2014. Right. And they're kind of, they're the heart of her work. They're kind of the thing that she came back to over and over again, you know, making these kind of comical scenes. She also had, like Jessica Park, had kind of obsessions with electronic instruments and astrological phenomenon. Galen had these kind of enthusiasms for musical instruments, particularly Nickelodeon's self-playing pianos like this. She shows the cousins dancing around. She also, you know, had enthusiasms for big old houses, for, as you mentioned, the granite industry in Vermont. Barre, Vermont is the granite capital of the world. So the things that she grew up around, you know, these are images, granite-based images of Galen's work. And I know you played a role in helping to bring her work to a larger audience since she passed away in 2005. For example, you know, there was a phenomenal exhibition just this last year at Fort Gansevoort Gallery in New York City that was curated by the artist Laurie Simmons. Can you tell us a little bit about that role that you play in helping to bring Grace artists like Galen to a larger public in that context outside of Grace itself?
Right. Well, I work with anybody that I can find that has a venue that would be good for Grace. The DeCordova, they asked for work, and they came and picked up her giant Nickelodeon, which was great fun. So I go, you know, the Fort Gansevoort, which is wonderful, happened because I was in New York and I went in there and spoke about Galen, and that's how that came about. But and Louise Ross was the same way. So you know, I'm always looking for venues for Galen or some of the other Grace artists also.
Yeah, no, I know there are a lot of artists who are lesser known, but you know, Meryl Densmore is one of my favorites. Larry Bissonette is fabulous. There are many artists who have worked through Grace, and you have a permanent collection at Grace, which you use to lend to museums, to galleries, et cetera, for these exhibitions. So,
right, we have a consigned collection also. So, yeah.
You know, that's great. Well, thank you, Kathy. And I think next we have Ray Materson. And Ray, if you want to unmute yourself. Well, just while Ray's getting set up, I'll note, you know, as we have formed a small collection of the work of self-taught artists with connections to this region, you know, as a curator, I'm always trying to think of, you know, how can I, you know, incorporate this work into our programming here at the museum. So this is an installation shot of some of Galen's work paired with Dwayne Michaels, who is a contemporary photographer of some renown. He summered, or he actually had a second home up in upstate New York, not far from Bennington. And I love this kind of juxtaposition, again, to kind of maybe show relationships between works that you might not automatically see. You know, Michaels is known for writing directly on his prints and exploring kind of the mystery and magic of the world, which is exactly what Galen Aiken did. So in this installation, which I called Mystery and Magic, I paired her work with Dwayne Michaels' photographs. Ray, are you with us?
I'm with you.
Great. I just can't
Hello.
see it on my screen, but so, you know, Ray, you're another artist. You know, I think I was familiar with your work, but I hadn't known that you had lived and worked briefly in Vermont. And so, you know, you have been working, you know, and fairly well known since the mid 90s. You know, and Ray started, he's a self-taught artist, and he started making miniature embroideries from unraveled sock thread while he was in prison serving a 15-year term connected to drug-related offenses. Can you give us a little bit of your background and how you came to your art and some of the kind of themes and ideas that you've explored in your work?
I'd be happy to, Jamie. And it's Materson, not Materson.
Materson, excuse me. Thank you.
Well, I started while I was, as you said, incarcerated, and I was kind of given I guess, a vision of my grandmother who used to sit on our front porch when I was a kid and embroider. And I was thinking about that and thinking about that. And as it turned out, while I was thinking about that, the University of Michigan, who was, my favorite football team, was going to be playing in the Rose Bowl. And the fellow in the next cell had some maize, if you will, and blue socks hanging out on the bars to dry. So I bought them for him for a pack of cigarettes. And I borrowed a needle from the block guard, and I sewed a University of Michigan emblem, which I sewed onto a hat that I also made. And as soon as I started sporting it around the old tier, guys were coming up to me and saying, "Yo, man, can you make me something?" And the next thing you know, I'm making all variety of, Puerto Rican flags, Italian flags, hearts and flowers emblems for guys. And they're paying me in cartons of cigarettes, which is big money in the joint. And from there, I went on and started experimenting with designing my own pieces, and they eventually got out into to the American Primitive Gallery down in New York, and they sold like almost immediately, which Arn Anton, who's the director curator there, assured me was really quite phenomenal. And from then on, so I've been creating art ever since. And yeah, I've done a lot of work. There was a show of my work that included a lot of pieces that had to do with drug addiction. And the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation became aware of it and gave me a huge grant to create art and to start an art project for students that were deemed to have drug addiction liabilities. And so good things came of it.
That's wonderful. And
in fact, the pieces that I did for that you acquired for the Bennington Museum,
yep,
had to do with what I saw when I lived in Vermont.
Yeah,
and I
so,
worked as
and I found out that you had lived in Vermont, and I hadn't known that. And so I contacted you directly. And actually what we're seeing on the screen, just so you know, Ray, I didn't have these on our run through the other day. These are some of the sketches. When I contacted you, I was familiar with your work. I was familiar with a lot of the work that you had done related to substance abuse. And, I said, what do you have anything that you had created while you were in Vermont or related to your time here? And you said, well, not really. And I told you my interest in kind of the work related to substance abuse, and you started coming up with ideas. And so the image at the left, you made a sketch, a marker sketch, and then a pencil sketch of the piece on the right. And then at the bottom right is that piece in process. And I really enjoyed our dialogue about thinking about, how you could connect to your experiences here in Vermont and create work in relationship to it. And it was like any other dialogue that I'd have with a contemporary artist, but I didn't mean to interrupt, Ray. Can you tell us a little bit about, you worked as a social worker here in Vermont between 2009 and 2011 when you lived here. And so you were drawing on those experiences. Can you tell us a little bit about that work and kind of your creative process when you were designing and coming up with these ideas?
Well, one of the things that struck me about Vermont, I mean, it's an absolutely beautiful, stunning state, but it's also a state of great contrast. When I worked, I traveled like from different homes to visit with clients. And while I would pass these multi-million-dollar estates and mansions that were owned by the upper crust in Vermont,
usually second homes.
I would, yeah, I know. But I would go visit the client who would live in, you know, virtual shacks, and they tended to the, you know, the cows or the, you know, um, maple sugaring stuff for the really wealthy folks. And so that kind of moved me. And also, you know, Vermont had, and I can't remember the governor's name at the time, but
Governor
he
Shumlin.
devoted most of his state, Governor Shumlin, yes,
Yep.
devoted most of his State of the State address back in
2014.
2009 or
It was exactly at the moment that
2014.
we were in
Okay.
correspondence and you were working on these, which is, you know, kind of what made it so brilliant.
And because, you know, I mean, Vermont is, people think of Vermont and they think of, you know, of Stowe and skiing and all these beautiful things, but there's a significant opioid abuse problem in Vermont, and the governor addressed that in his State of the State. And so I was also considering that when I did the piece that's on the left there, and because it's the mountains, and the BT for Vermont is made with syringes and a spoon. Um, so yeah, so that was the inspiration for that.
You know, and
And I've, you know,
the one on the
I've
right,
continued to.
which you called Vermont Mother in Despair. I mean, again, based on your experiences working with people and kind of, you know, issues of economic disadvantage, substance abuse, incarceration. I think your work allows me as a curator to address these issues that are so important to us today. And you know, that's not even to talk about your incredible craftsmanship. I mean, these are 2.5 by 3-inch embroideries, so people are clear. And I know that you said some of them have upwards of 1,200 stitches per inch and take you upwards of 90 hours to create. It's really remarkable work. And so, you know, I was just excited to be able to work with you. And we were able to acquire these two, luckily, for the museum's collection. But you know, you created these without me having ever like committed to anything, which is what was so wonderful. We just had this conversation, and it happened so kind of organically. You started sending me these sketches of ideas that were coming to you, you know, and I think actually Arnie actually showed Vermont Mother in Despair at the Outsider Art Fair. And I saw it and I went, oh God, we need to get that. And luckily a couple of months later, you know, you offered them to the museum and we were able to make it work. So I think your work is so powerful and speaks to so many issues that we continue to deal with in the state of Vermont today. It's great that we have them to be able to share. And, you know, I think, you know, that's kind of, you know, I wanted to also share some of these more recent work of yours. You know, you continue to work on commission. And can you share maybe just, you know, quickly some of the stories behind these two more recent works of yours?
Sure. The piece on the left is a piece that I call Sally's Ride, and the story is from my book Sins and Needles. And I was doing the embroidery in the prison, and one of the fellows that was a fellow inmate who had AIDS, and he's pictured here holding the picture of the eagle, and he had come up to me one day, and he held up this picture of this eagle, and he said, "Hey man, could you like do this for me? Because the eagle is my symbol." And I was really touched and moved by that, because here's this man he was literally scarred up from the AIDS and so on, and the eagle was his symbol, which is such a contrast in, you know, freedom and beauty to, you know, being caged and ill like this. And people, the gentleman in the background is just symbolizes how people would try to avoid him and shun him because of the AIDS. And I never got around, sadly, to doing the eagle piece for him because he passed away. The piece on the right is a recent commission. a gentleman contacted me that had a penchant for pulp fiction magazine art covers. And so he sent me a bunch of images and said, would you be able to do something like this? So I did, and I did several pieces of work for him actually.
That's great. You know, and I know that
And,
we're
you know, and I can
what was that, Ray?
oh, go.
Oh, no.
You're
So
good.
I was just saying, you know, I know that we're coming up on an hour, and I'm sure that there are some people that have some questions, and they might want to ask some of the other panelists. So, you know, we'll open it up to some of those questions now.
Sure. This is a question for Gregg. It's going back to the top of the talk where you were talking about Schmidt's work, the shrines. They wanted to know if those shrines were designated to anything or anyone. Gregg, you'll need to unmute.
Yes. Yeah, yes, they were. There was a Kennedy shrine for the Kennedys. There was a shrine to the American nurses. George Washington shrine. There were a number of them that he had titled.
Yep.
At one point, I started recognizing the singular pieces in this rambling environment, and those shrines appeared as part of that group of singular pieces of sculpture.
Yeah. Okay. Next up, we have a question. I think this is for Kathy in regards to Grace. So, Kathy, do you contact curators at museums directly to review work for their collections or shows?
No, I haven't in the past.
Okay.
But that's a good idea. It's a good suggestion.
Yeah.
You know, I obviously reached out to Grace,
Right,
and that's how I met you, Kathy, because
That's right.
I became familiar with Galen's work. Galen is often referred to as kind of Vermont's Grandma Moses, which is not a theory I subscribe to. Their work is very, very different. You know, I think one of the reasons I love Grace is because you do provide a platform for these artists. And, you know, one of the reasons I invited you and wanted to talk about Galen's work and about the work that Grace does is that it's so important to, you know, share this work with larger audiences. And you know, so, you know, I think curators do a lot of work of reaching out, but, you know, keep up the good work that you're doing, because I think, you know, this work is obviously the work of self-taught artists, particularly in the last, you know, 10 years or so, has become mainstream. I mean, you know, the Souls Grown Deep Foundation, which is focused on the work of artists of color in the American South, largely, you know, been acquired by the Met, by you know, museums across the Minneapolis Museum of Art, the San Francisco Museum of Fine Arts. So, you know, I think, you know, museum curators are starting to become more aware of this, but, you know, I think, you know, it's my role as a curator is to think about how we can incorporate these into the narratives that we tell. And, you know, I mentioned Tony Jangarelli, who is the director of the Jessica Park Project. You know, he continues to keep, you know, he's technically a professor emeritus. He continues to teach courses. And one of the reasons that one of the things that he does and he uses outsider art for is to teach the concept of IDEA, or IDEA, or inclusivity, diversity, equity, and access, because these artists who, you know, many of them come from disenfranchised backgrounds, whether that be economic, racial, or otherwise, and they allow us to expand the sorts of stories that we can tell at museums. That's one of the reasons that I have really been interested in collecting their work, so we can diversify the stories that we tell. You know, Ray talking about issues of economic equality and substance abuse here in Vermont. They're real issues, and you know, mainstream artists sometimes address these issues, but you know, the idea of grassroots and from the bottom up, I think, is so important. And the artists that create this, you know, have that sort of personal experience. It's never, they rarely approach the topic from irony. You know, it comes from who they are as people and the lives that they live.
Yeah. Absolutely. On that, we've reached the top. So that was fascinating. Maybe I'll pull one more question and then we'll have to call it. So let's do, there are quite a few here, so I'm sorry I won't get to everyone. This is quite broad. What advice do you have, and this is for everyone, what advice do you have for someone beginning to practice art, collect art, or consider art? Or go for it.
Yeah, no, I say just do it.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the great things about, grace is that, oftentimes people don't necessarily have the tools at hand or the encouragement or the space or the time. And but you can do so much with so little, and so many of these artists prove that. Ray, he came to his practice in prison and started unraveling socks and using, Ray told me a great story, and can you tell, maybe Ray can say this, about how you came, your mom started sending you extra large boxers.
Yeah, because as she said, it's the same price and you get more material. So I was getting extra 2X size boxer shorts to sew onto. But also, before we totally close up, I want to get a plug in for Andrew Edlin, who has a couple of pieces of my work available right now at the Outsider Art Fair. And I was honored to be included in the Christie's auction 2 weeks
no,
ago.
your work has definitely
a lot
gotten a lot of traction lately. It's
Absolutely.
great. And I don't want to drag this on too much longer. I know we should be closing up here shortly, but I see one more question, which is for Ray, and I think it's a really good one.
Oh, there, go for it.
And it says, and this is for you, Ray. It says, how do you feel about being identified as, quote, an outsider artist or a self-taught artist? Would you prefer to be identified that way, or would you prefer to just be referred to as an artist?
Well, I always thought it was ironic because I started doing the art while I was in prison, and you don't get more inside than that. And yet I was called an outsider artist. And I couldn't have been more inside if I tried. I think that labels are large, I'm going to say largely economic. I mean, if you're a mainstream contemporary artist, your art, garners more money than somebody who's considered an outsider folk artist. So, I don't know. Being an artist is definitely artist is what I prefer, but I'm really blessed and grateful to be able to share my work and my thoughts with people however they want to think of it.
Another just little tiny anecdote related, I mentioned, I loved our correspondence when you were creating your work, and it was just like working with any other contemporary artist. And, I won't say who it was, but somebody at the museum, said, well, talking to Ray about his work and talking about, themes that you're interested in, and, now that he's not in prison, does that make his work less authentic? And my idea was like, no, it doesn't make it any less authentic. He's still doing what he does. He has this practice that was born out of his personal experience, and he continues to address his personal experience. So for me, I think as a curator, labels can be helpful. And I think, we need to be understanding of, the context. Every artist creates work within their own context, whether they're, showing their work at a New York City gallery or, making it on the hillside in Woodstock, New York, like Clarence Schmidt. They're all creating their work in their own context. And as a curator, my job is just to help the museum audience understand those contexts so that they can better understand the work at hand.
Great. I think we'll leave it there. I just wanted to.
I believe that.
Go. Go for it, Ray. Go.
I believe we're all intended to create. I think that that's part of our nature, to create, to build, to do. And if it's not nurtured, if it's not encouraged, if we don't pursue it, then a lot of times the opposite can happen, and we can become self-destructive like many, many people with addiction problems have. So I say, yeah, create, do, because it's part of who you are, whoever you are.
Great. Well, thank you.
Ta-da.
Great.
Thank you to Ray and to Greg and to
Great
Kathy. I think
way
this
to
was a great
leave it.
conversation.
Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to remind you all that this conversation has been recorded, and we'll put it up on our website at a later date, so you can always go back and refer to it. And so thank you, Jamie. Thank you to the Bennington Museum. Thank you, Kathy, Greg, and Ray. This was a really wonderful discussion. And yeah, we will see you soon. And don't forget, check out The Outsider Out There. We're on until February 7. You can go online right now and take a look at some of the works on our online viewing rooms as well. Okay, have a lovely afternoon.
Thanks,
See you
everybody.
later, everyone. Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.